The morning sun cast long shadows across the sleek glassed and steel penthouse as Regina Chen adjusted her cream-colored Channel jacket. At 42, she had everything most people could only dream of. A corner office in Manhattan's most prestigious building, a collection of luxury cars, and even her own helipad. This particular Tuesday seemed like any other, with her helicopter scheduled to whisk her away to another busy day running Tech Fusion Global, her $4 billion tech empire. Her heels clicked against the concrete of the helipad as she checked her phone one last time. The morning's headlines praised her latest philanthropic venture, a $50 million donation to support young women in STEM fields. Little did she know, these would be the last positive headlines about her for a very long time. The wind picked up, blowing her perfectly styled hair as she heard the distant thump of helicopter blades. But something was off. The sound wasn't getting closer. Instead, the heavy metal door to the helipad burst open, and a team of FBI agents in dark windbreakers poured onto the roof. Regina Chen, a tall agent, called out, his badge glinting in the morning sun. "You're under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The woman who had graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, who had given inspiring speeches at prestigious universities, who had shaken hands with presidents and prime ministers, stood completely still. Her phone slipped from her manicured fingers, clattering onto the helipad. People in nearby buildings pressed against their windows, phones recording as the scene unfolded. The mighty CEO of Tech Fusion Global, known for her rags-to-riches story and inspiration to millions, was being handcuffed right on top of the building that bore her company's name. Regina's mind raced back to just last week, when she had hosted a lavish charity gala in this very building. She had stood at the podium, champagne in hand, talking about integrity and innovation. The irony wasn't lost on her now, as cool metal bracelets replaced her usual diamond ones. The agents led her toward the door, but Regina kept her head high. Her employees, watching from their office windows below, would later describe the surreal sight of their CEO being escorted across the helipad where her private helicopter usually landed. Some even caught the moment on their phones when she paused briefly at the door, turned around, and took one last look at the empire she had built. Or perhaps, as the world would soon learn, the castle of cards she had carefully constructed. What made the scene even more dramatic was the morning news helicopter that happened to be passing by, capturing the arrest in high definition. Within hours, the footage would be playing on every major news channel, accompanied by shocking headlines about the fall of America's most celebrated female CEO. As the elevator descended from the penthouse, Regina stood silently between two FBI agents, her mind presumably on her teenage daughter, who would soon be waking up to get ready for school, unaware that her mother wouldn't be coming home that night. The same elevator she had ridden thousands of times before, planning meetings and making billion-dollar decisions, now felt like a cage taking her down to a reality she never thought she'd face. The lobby of Tech Fusion Tower, usually bustling with ambitious employees and important clients, fell into a stunned silence as agents escorted their CEO through the marble atrium. The same people who would normally scramble to greet her now watched in shocked silence, their morning coffee cups frozen halfway to their lips, as the woman they had admired and feared in equal measure was led away in handcuffs. Nobody knew it yet, but this was just the beginning of a story that would shake the corporate world to its core, revealing secrets that had been buried under years of success, philanthropy, and carefully crafted public relations. The fall of Regina Chen was about to become more than just another corporate scandal. It would become a tale of ambition, deception, and the price of the American dream. 3 months before her dramatic arrest, Regina Chen sat in her corner office on the 50th floor, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the Manhattan skyline. She held a silver frame containing a faded photograph, one she never showed anyone. In it, a young Regina stood with her parents outside their small dry-cleaning business in Queens, their tired smiles telling a story of long hours and endless sacrifice. That little girl could never have imagined she'd one day run a $4 billion tech company. Back then, her biggest worry was helping her parents with English translations and doing her homework by the dim light of the shop's back room. The memory of those humble beginnings usually brought her strength, but lately, it only added to the weight on her shoulders. Regina placed the photo face down on her desk as her assistant buzzed through the intercom. The board members are waiting in the conference room. Taking a deep breath, she smoothed her designer dress and grabbed her tablet. These quarterly meetings used to be her victory lap, a chance to showcase TechFusion's latest achievements. But today felt different. The conference room buzzed with tension as she entered. 12 pairs of eyes followed her to the head of the table. The latest product launch, an AI-powered personal assistant that was supposed to revolutionize home automation, had failed spectacularly. The stock price had dropped 15% in just 2 weeks, and shareholders were getting nervous. Our technical team is working around the clock, Regina assured them, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. We'll have an update ready within the month. She clicked through slides showing promising test results, careful to skip over the more troubling data. It wasn't exactly lying, she told herself. It was just selective truth-telling. After the meeting, Regina stood at her office window, watching the tiny cars below. 20 years ago, she'd started TechFusion in a cramped apartment with just 2 computers and a dream. Now she employed over 5,000 people. Their families depended on her. Their mortgages, their children's college funds, their retirement plans. All of it rested on keeping TechFusion's stock priced high. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter about dinner plans. Regina smiled, remembering how she used to carry her baby girl around the first TechFusion office in a sling while coding late into the night. Now her daughter was in high school, already talking about following in her mother's footsteps. The thought made Regina's chest tighten. Later that evening, as she reviewed the real numbers in private, the truth was unavoidable. The company's actual earnings were nowhere near what they were reporting to the public. What had started as small accounting adjustments to get through a rough quarter had snowballed into something much bigger and much more dangerous. Regina opened her laptop and logged into an offshore account, one of several she'd set up years ago. The balance was healthy, grown fat from stock sales she'd carefully timed and hidden through a maze of shell companies. It was supposed to be a safety net, but it was starting to feel more like evidence. She closed the laptop and walked to her office bar, pouring herself a drink. The city lights twinkled below, reminding her of the Christmas lights in her parents' shop. They had always taught her to be honest, to work hard, to earn everything she got. What would they think if they knew what their daughter had become? The phone on her desk rang. It was her old friend and CFO, Richard Lee, calling with more bad news. Another major client was threatening to pull out. As she listened, Regina's free hand found the family photo again. She ran her thumb over the glass, over her younger self's hopeful face. "Do whatever it takes," she told Richard, her voice firm. "We've come too far to fail now." She didn't know it then, but those words would come back to haunt her in ways she couldn't imagine. The empire she'd built with determination, brilliance, and, increasingly, deception was about to come crashing down. But for now, Regina Chen, the darling of Wall Street and inspiration to millions, stood alone in her tower, watching her reflection fade in the darkening window as night fell over the city that had helped make her dreams come true. Deep in the basement of TechFusion's gleaming headquarters, in a windowless office filled with the hum of fluorescent lights, David Park stared at his computer screen in disbelief. As a junior accountant fresh out of college, he'd been thrilled to land a job at such a prestigious company. Now, 6 months in, he wished he'd never noticed the numbers that didn't add up. It started with small discrepancies. Revenue figures that seemed a bit too perfect. Contracts with companies he couldn't find any information about. At first, he thought it was just his inexperience. But as he dug deeper, cross-referencing files late into the night while his colleagues headed home, a disturbing pattern emerged. One evening, as he was double-checking his findings for the 100th time, his supervisor walked by. "Still here, David. You should get some rest." There was something odd in her tone, a hint of concern that felt more like a warning. The next morning, David found himself moved to a different project. His access to certain financial records was suddenly restricted. "Just a routine rotation," his supervisor explained with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But David had already seen enough to know something was seriously wrong. He spent the next week carefully documenting everything he found. The company's public earnings reports showed steady growth, but the internal numbers told a different story. There were massive gaps, covered up by what looked like fake contracts and inflated sales figures. The more he looked, the worse it got. During lunch breaks, he noticed the whispers. Colleagues who used to chat with him now found reasons to eat at different times. In meetings, people avoided eye contact. The message was clear. He'd stuck his nose where it didn't belong. One rainy Tuesday, he gathered his courage and requested a meeting with the head of finance. The response came quickly. "Come to conference room B at 4 p.m. His heart pounding, David prepared his presentation, complete with highlighted spreadsheets showing the inconsistencies. But when he arrived, instead of the finance head, he found 3 stern-faced executives from legal and HR. "We understand you have some concerns," one began, sliding a thick document across the table. It was a non-disclosure agreement. The company values loyal employees who understand the importance of discretion. The threat was subtle but clear. Sign and stay quiet, or face consequences. David left the meeting feeling sick to his stomach. That night, he couldn't sleep, thinking about everything he'd seen. He thought about his parents, who taught him right from wrong. He thought about his younger sister, who looked up to him as a role model. The next morning, his security badge didn't work. "Your services are no longer required. Read the email from HR." His personal belongings arrived in a box at his apartment 2 days later, along with a severance check that seemed far too generous for 6 months of work. Most people would have taken the money and moved on. It was enough to pay off his student loans, maybe even put a down payment on a small apartment. But every time David closed his eyes, he saw those numbers, thought about the thousands of small investors who had put their life savings into Tech Fusion stock, believing in Regina Chen's vision. Late one night, after his 3rd failed job interview, it seemed word had spread about his disloyalty. David made his decision. With shaking hands, he opened his laptop and composed an email to the Securities and Exchange Commission. He attached his carefully organized evidence, took a deep breath, and clicked send. Within hours, he received a phone call from an SEC investigator. "We've been watching Tech Fusion for a while," the investigator said. "But we needed someone on the inside to confirm our suspicions. Are you willing to help us?" David looked around his small apartment, at the pile of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter, at the framed photo of his college graduation, where he stood proud in his cap and gown, ready to take on the world. He thought about Regina Chen, the CEO he once admired, whose success story had inspired him to apply to Tech Fusion in the first place. "Yes," he said finally, his voice stronger than he expected. "I'll help you. The truth needs to come out." He didn't know it then, but his decision would set in motion a chain of events that would shake the corporate world to its core. Sometimes, he realized, doing the right thing meant walking the harder path, even if you had to walk it alone. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit buzzed with activity at 6 a.m. Special Agent Lisa Chen, no relation to Regina, pinned another document to the growing investigation board. Red strings connected photos, bank statements, and complex diagrams. After 3 months of intense investigation, the puzzle pieces were finally coming together, and the picture they revealed was staggering. "You need to see this," called out her partner, Agent Rodriguez, waving a stack of papers. "We just got the records from the Cayman Islands." He spread the documents across their shared desk, pointing to a series of transactions. "Look at these dates. Every time Tech Fusion announced a big contract, money moved through these offshore accounts. It's not just creative accounting, it's a full-blown fraud scheme. The investigation had started small, triggered by that brave whistleblower's report. But like pulling a loose thread on a sweater, the more they tugged, the more everything unraveled. Behind Tech Fusion's perfect success story lay a web of lies so complex it took a team of forensic accountants working round the clock to untangle it. In a dimly lit conference room, Agent Chen reviewed security footage from Tech Fusion's office. The camera caught Regina Chen working late into the night, weeks before major announcements. She wasn't just the face of the company, Agent Chen muttered. She orchestrated everything. The evidence was damning. Fake contracts with shell companies, inflated revenue reports, a network of offshore accounts used to hide money. But what struck the investigators most was how long it had gone undetected. Regina Chen hadn't just built a tech company. She'd created an illusion so convincing it fooled some of the smartest minds on Wall Street. "Look at this," Agent Rodriguez said, pulling up an old interview. On screen, Regina confidently discussed Tech Fusion's growth. "Our success comes from innovation and hard work," she claimed, while behind the scenes, her team was cooking the books. The contrast between her public image and private actions was jarring. The investigation team set up in a hotel room near Tech Fusion Tower, monitoring key employees. They watched Richard Lee, the CFO, as he left work each evening, noticing how he'd aged years in just months. The weight of secrets was visible in his hunched shoulders and worried frown. One breakthrough came from an unlikely source, a cleaning lady who worked the night shift. She remembered seeing Regina shredding documents late one night, tears streaming down her face. She just kept feeding papers into the machine, the woman recalled. Her hands were shaking so bad she could barely hold them. The team discovered that Regina had been selling her own shares through various shell companies while publicly claiming complete confidence in Tech Fusion's future. She knew it would all fall apart eventually, Agent Chen realized. She was preparing her escape route while telling everyone else to stay on board. The scale of the fraud was stunning. Over $800 million in fake contracts, thousands of falsified documents, hundreds of innocent employees who would lose their jobs when the truth came out. The investigation team worked weekends, ordered late-night takeout, and missed family events, driven by the urgency of building an airtight case. "We're not just taking down a CEO," Agent Chen told her team during a late-night briefing. "We're exposing a system that allowed this to happen." People trusted Regina Chen. They invested their life savings because they believed in her story. The final piece fell into place when they found Regina's personal notebooks, hidden in a safe deposit box. Page after page showed calculations, plans, and notes that revealed her growing desperation as the fraud spiraled out of control. "I had no choice," she'd written in one margin. "Too many people depend on us to succeed." As dawn broke over the city, Agent Chen made the call that would change everything. "We're ready," she told her supervisor. "We move tomorrow morning." She looked out at the Tech Fusion Tower, its windows glinting in the rising sun. Tomorrow, that same sun would rise on a very different world for Regina Chen. The team spent the rest of the day preparing for the arrest. They coordinated with local police, planned their approach, and rehearsed every detail. Nobody wanted any mistakes in what would become one of the biggest corporate fraud cases in history. That night, as Agent Chen finally headed home, she passed a newsstand. Regina Chen's face smiled from a magazine cover, named Business Leader of the Year. By this time tomorrow, that magazine would be a collector's item. A reminder that sometimes the biggest lies come wrapped in the most believable packages. Richard Lee sat in the cold interrogation room, staring at his reflection in the two-way mirror. His designer suit, usually crisp and perfect, was wrinkled from spending the night in custody. Dark circles under his eyes told the story of sleepless nights that had become all too common lately. As CFO of Tech Fusion and Regina's right-hand man for 15 years, he knew this day would eventually come. He just hadn't expected it to hurt so much. "More coffee?" asked Agent Rodriguez, sliding a fresh cup across the table. The kindness in the gesture made Richard's eyes water. After decades of five-star restaurants and executive lounges, here he was, grateful for cheap police station coffee. His mind wandered back to 1999, when he first met Regina. She was just a brilliant young programmer then, working out of a tiny office, dreaming big dreams. He'd been teaching finance at the local community college, looking for something more exciting than grading papers. Regina's passion had been infectious. Together, she'd said, "We'll build something amazing." And they had. Those early years were like magic. Late nights fueled by instant noodles and determination, celebrating their first $1 million contract, watching their tiny team grow. Regina had been more than his boss. She'd been his friend, his mentor, almost like a daughter. When did it all change? Agent Rodriguez asked, interrupting his thoughts. Richard sighed, straightening his tie out of habit. It was so gradual, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. At first, it was just moving some numbers around to make a bad quarter look better. Regina called it creative accounting. We told ourselves it was temporary, just until things improved. But things never improved enough. One small lie led to another, then another. Soon they were creating fake contracts, inflating revenue figures, hiding losses in a maze of shell companies. Richard had raised concerns at first, but Regina always had an answer, a justification, a bigger dream to chase. "She has this way of making you believe," Richard explained, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. "When she talks about the future, about changing the world through technology, you want to believe. You need to believe." The agents placed photos on the table. Regina and Richard at company parties, award ceremonies, charity galas. 15 years of memories, of shared triumphs and secrets. In one photo, Regina was giving a speech at Richard's 60th birthday party, calling him the father she wished she'd had growing up. "We need your help, Mr. Lee," Agent Chen said gently. "You know things nobody else does. You can help make this right." Richard picked up one of the photos, his hands trembling. It showed him and Regina at the opening of Tech Fusion's new headquarters. She was cutting the ribbon, beaming with pride. He stood beside her, applauding, completely unaware that the building was built with money that didn't really exist. "My grandchildren read about her in school," he said, his voice breaking. "They wrote reports about her, calling her their hero. How do I tell them the truth? How do I tell them I helped her lie?" The decision to cooperate wasn't just about saving himself. It was about all the people who trusted them. The employees who'd poured their hearts into the company, the investors who'd believed in their vision, the students who'd looked up to Regina as a role model. As Richard began to talk, the words poured out like a dam breaking. He told them everything. The fake contracts, the hidden accounts, the manipulated stock sales. With each revelation, the weight on his shoulders grew lighter, replaced by a different kind of burden. The knowledge that his testimony would help destroy the woman he'd loved like family. Hours later, as agents escorted him out, Richard caught a glimpse of the evening news on a lobby TV. Regina's arrest was the top story. The camera caught her proud posture, her defiant expression. Even in handcuffs, she looked unbreakable. That was Regina, always performing, always in control of her image. But Richard knew the truth. He'd seen her cry in her office when the pressure became too much. He'd watched her hands shake as she signed fraudulent documents. He'd heard her voice crack when she talked about her teenage daughter's future. As he stepped into the cold evening air, Richard thought about the legacy they'd built together, now crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Sometimes betrayal wasn't about choosing right over wrong. It was about finally admitting that what you thought was right had been wrong all along. The Metropolitan Detention Center was a far cry from Regina's penthouse suite. Her designer clothes had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit, her luxury king-size bed swapped for a thin mattress on a metal frame. But even here, sitting in a cramped meeting room with her legal team, Regina Chen carried herself like the CEO she'd been just weeks ago. "They have nothing," she insisted, tapping her finger on the stack of evidence her lawyers had brought. "Every transaction was approved by our board. Every contract was reviewed by legal." Her voice held the same confidence that had convinced thousands to invest in tech fusion, but her lawyers exchanged worried glances. Lead attorney Robert Wilson, who defended some of Wall Street's biggest names, cleared his throat. "Regina, the evidence is substantial. Richard's testimony alone." He stopped as Regina's hand slammed the table. "Richard betrayed me," she hissed, her composure cracking for the first time. "After everything I did for him. I made him rich. I trusted him like a father." Her voice caught on the last word, and she turned to face the small window with its steel bars. The legal team worked late into the evening, reviewing thousands of documents. They built their defense around Regina's claim that she was unaware of the fraud, that subordinates had acted without her knowledge. But each new piece of evidence made that story harder to believe. Back in her cell, Regina received a letter from her daughter. The teenager wrote out switching schools after classmates shared cruel memes about her mom. "Some kids made a TikTok video mocking you," she wrote. "Dad says we might need to move." Regina read the letter over and over until the paper grew damp with tears. Her husband's weekly visits became more strained. He'd lost his consulting clients. Nobody wanted to work with the husband of the biggest fraudster since Bernie Madoff, as the papers called her. Their assets were frozen, their reputation destroyed. "The neighbors won't even look at me," he told her. 15 years of friendship, gone overnight. Regina's defense team arranged a series of interviews with sympathetic journalists. She wore her old CEO mask well, speaking confidently about her immigrant parents, her rise from poverty, her dedication to advancing women in tech. But the public wasn't buying it anymore. Comments under the articles called her a snake, a thief, a disgrace to female entrepreneurs everywhere. Late at night, alone in her cell, Regina wrote in a journal her lawyers had brought her. "They don't understand," she scribbled. "I had to protect the company. So many people depended on us. I couldn't let it fail." The words sounded hollow even to her. The prosecution's evidence kept mounting. Emails Regina had thought were deleted resurfaced. Former employees came forward with stories of being pressured to fake numbers. The offshore accounts were traced directly to her. Her defense strategy crumbled piece by piece. During a particularly tough prep session, Regina broke down. "I just wanted to keep the dream alive," she told her lawyers. "We were changing the world, creating jobs, inspiring people. If the stock price fell, it would all disappear. I couldn't let that happen." Her teenage daughter's next visit hit the hardest. The girl looked thinner, her eyes red from crying. "Why did you do it, Mom?" she asked. "My friend's parents lost their retirement savings investing in your company. People trusted you." Regina reached across the table to touch her daughter's hand, but the girl pulled away. The same hands that had once tucked her into bed, that had taught her to code, that had built a billion-dollar company, they now seemed alien and untrustworthy to her own child. That night, Regina faced the hardest decision of her life. Her lawyers presented two options: maintain her innocence and likely face maximum prison time, or admit guilt and cooperate for a lighter sentence. The evidence was overwhelming. Richard's testimony had sealed her fate. Staring at her reflection in the metal mirror of her cell, Regina barely recognized herself. The powerful CEO was gone, replaced by a woman in prison orange who'd lost everything that mattered. Her reputation, her freedom, her family's trust. All sacrificed for what? To keep a lie alive a little longer. The next morning, she called her legal team. "I'm ready," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "I'll tell the truth. All of it." Sometimes, she realized, the only way to save what little you have left is to stop pretending you never lost it all in the first place. The federal courthouse was packed as Regina Chen took the witness stand. The designer suits and power heels were gone, replaced by a simple navy dress her lawyers had chosen to make her appear more humble. For the first time in decades, she wore no makeup, no jewelry, nothing to hide behind. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began. Regina's voice, once commanding boardrooms and TE talks, came out barely above a whisper. The judge asked her to speak up. As she repeated her name, her eyes found her daughter in the front row, sitting beside her husband. The teenager looked away. "Miss Chen, tell us about your childhood," her defense attorney prompted gently. Regina closed her eyes for a moment, then began to speak. The courtroom fell silent as she described growing up in her parents' tiny dry cleaning shop in Queens. "We lived in the back room," she explained. "My parents worked 16 hours a day, but we could barely afford rent. I did my homework by the light of the ironing station." Her voice cracked. "One winter, the heating broke. We couldn't afford to fix it. I watched my father cry for the first time as he wrapped me in all the clean blankets from the shop." The story spilled out. How her father's gambling addiction had torn the family apart. How she'd come home from school one day to find their apartment empty, her mother gone. How her father had disappeared a month later, leaving 14-year-old Regina alone with mountains of debt. "I promised myself I would never be powerless again," she said, her hands gripping the witness stand. "I studied harder than anyone. Got scholarships. Worked 3 jobs through college. I thought if I just became successful enough, powerful enough, I could make sure nobody I loved would ever feel that helpless." As she spoke about founding Tech Fusion, her voice grew stronger. She described the early days of excitement and innovation, the thrill of creating something new. But then came the pressure, from investors, the board, the market. "Success is like a tiger," she said. "Once you're riding it, you can't get off without being eaten." The prosecutor stepped forward. "When did you first falsify company records?" The question hung in the air. Regina glanced at her daughter again, then straightened her shoulders. "It started small," she admitted. "We had a bad quarter in 2018. If our stock dropped, we'd lose a major partnership deal. Thousands of jobs were at stake. I told myself it was just temporary. Move some numbers around, hide the losses until things improved." She paused. But they never improved enough. The court listened as Regina detailed how the deception grew. Each lie required another lie to cover it. Each fake success set a higher bar for the next quarter. "It was like quicksand," she said. "The harder I tried to fight my way out, the deeper I sank." The prosecution presented emails, contracts, bank statements. Regina confirmed each one, explaining how she'd orchestrated the fraud. Her voice remained steady, but her hands shook as she pointed to specific documents. "Why didn't you stop?" the prosecutor asked. "You must have known it would all collapse eventually." Regina looked down at her hands. "Have you ever told a lie to protect someone you love?" she asked quietly. "Then told another lie to protect the first one. And another, until the truth feels like a weapon that would destroy everything and everyone you care about." She described the sleepless nights, the panic attacks hidden in her private bathroom between meetings. "I kept thinking, just one more quarter. Just keep it going a little longer. If I could just buy enough time, somehow make it all real." A tear finally escaped, rolling down her cheek. "I became what I feared most as a child, someone who hurt people by trying to protect them. I told myself I was saving jobs, inspiring women in tech, living the American dream. But I was just that scared little girl again, trying to fix things by pretending they weren't broken." The courtroom was silent as Regina finished her testimony. Her husband held their crying daughter. Former employees wiped their eyes. Even some jurors looked shaken. The truth, finally spoken aloud, seemed to fill the room like smoke, making it hard to breathe. As she stepped down from the witness stand, Regina caught her reflection in a window. For the first time in years, she recognized herself, not as the powerful CEO she pretended to be, but as the person she truly was, flaws and fears and all. Sometimes, she realized, you have to lose everything you built on lies to find what's real. After 6 weeks of trial, the day of sentencing arrived. The courtroom was even more crowded than during Regina's testimony. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching toward the gray winter sky like metal trees. Inside, every bench was packed with former employees, investors, and curious onlookers. Regina sat at the defense table, wearing a simple black dress. She looked smaller somehow, as if the truth had physically shrunk her. Her daughter, sitting in the front row, hadn't stopped crying all morning. Her husband held the teenager's hand, his own eyes red-rimmed and tired. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and kind eyes, adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the sentencing documents. The room held its breath. Everyone knew this moment would make headlines across the world. Regina Chen, the judge began, her voice clear and firm, you stand before this court having pleaded guilty to multiple counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. She paused, looking directly at Regina. The scale of your deception is staggering. Over $800 million in fraudulent transactions. Thousands of investors misled. Countless lives affected. Regina kept her head high, but her hands trembled slightly on the table. Behind her, a former Tech Fusion employee whispered to his colleague, I lost my entire retirement fund. Another added, my kids' college savings gone. The judge continued, your actions have shaken public trust in corporate America. Young entrepreneurs who looked up to you now question everything they believed about success and integrity. The ripple effects of your crimes will be felt for years to come. Regina's lawyer stood to make one final plea for leniency, highlighting her cooperation with authorities, her clean record before Tech Fusion, her difficult childhood. The prosecutor countered by emphasizing the scale of the fraud and the lives destroyed. Before I deliver your sentence, the judge said, would you like to make a final statement? Regina rose slowly, her legs unsteady. The microphone picked up her shaky breath. Your Honor, she began, her voice barely steady, I stand here stripped of everything I once thought defined me. My company, my reputation, my pride. But for the first time in years, I can see clearly. She turned to face the crowded courtroom. To everyone I hurt, the employees who trusted me, the investors who believed in me, the young women who saw me as a role model, I am deeply sorry. No explanation can justify what I did. No apology can repair the damage. Her voice broke as she looked at her daughter. To my family, especially my precious girl, I'm sorry I taught you that success matters more than truth. I'm sorry I became someone you can't be proud of anymore. The judge nodded, then straightened her papers. Regina Chen, this court sentences you to 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. You are ordered to pay $500 million in restitution to your victims. The gavel's bang echoed through the silent courtroom. Regina's daughter let out a sob. 7 years. Her little girl would be in college before she got out. As court officers approached to take her into custody, Regina turned to her family one last time. Her daughter finally met her eyes. In that moment, something passed between them. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But perhaps understanding. Sometimes love means accepting someone at their worst, even while grieving who you thought they were. Her husband mouthed, I love you, as the officers led her away. Regina's last glimpse of the courtroom caught Richard Lee, her former CFO and mentor, wiping tears from his eyes. Even after his testimony helped convict her, she saw the pain in his face. Some bonds, she realized, run deeper than betrayal. In the holding cell, waiting to be transported to prison, Regina touched the bare spot on her finger where her wedding ring had been. 7 years to think about her choices. 7 years to figure out who she was without the masks and lies. 7 years to prove that true redemption starts with accepting the consequences of your actions. Outside, reporters rush to file their stories. Tech Queen gets 7 years. Tech Fusion CEO sentenced. Regina Chen's empire crumbles. But inside that small cell, a different headline was writing itself. A story about truth, consequences, and the long road to becoming the person you should have been all along. 3 years into her sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution, Regina Chen sat in the prison library, surrounded by a small group of women. She wasn't wearing designer clothes anymore, but her eyes sparkled with the same intensity that once commanded boardrooms. The trick isn't just saving money, she explained to her eager audience. It's understanding how money works. The women, all fellow inmates, leaned forward, notebooks open. 3 years ago, these same women had watched Regina arrive, broken and ashamed. Now, they saw someone different. Regina had started the prison's financial literacy program 6 months into her sentence. At first, only 2 women showed up. But word spread quickly. The famous CEO was teaching real-world skills, helping women plan for life after release. Soon, the class grew to 30 regular students. "Remember Amy?" one inmate whispered to another. "She got out last month. Already started her own cleaning business using what she learned here." Regina smiled, hearing them. Amy had written her a letter, proudly describing how she'd opened her first business bank account. The prison guards noticed a change in Regina too. Gone was the arrogance, the need to control everything. Instead, they saw a woman who spent her free time helping others with appeal paperwork, teaching basic computer skills, and most importantly, sharing stories of her own mistakes as warnings. One evening, while cleaning the library after class, Regina found an old business magazine with her face on the cover. The headline read, "Tech's Rising Star." She barely recognized that polished, perfect version of herself. The woman in the photo was all surface, no substance, a masterpiece of careful illusions. Her daughter's visits became the highlight of her months. The teenager, now in college, brought textbooks from her business ethics class. Sometimes, they discussed cases together, Regina offering insights that no textbook could provide. "Mom," her daughter said during one visit, "they actually used your case as an example today. But the professor didn't know the whole story like I do now." Regina's husband had rebuilt his consulting practice, smaller but more honest. "I tell clients about what happened," he told her. "Some walk away. But others stay because they want to learn from our mistakes." Their marriage, tested by prison walls and public shame, had somehow grown stronger through brutal honesty. The biggest surprise came when Richard Lee, her former CFO who had testified against her, wrote a letter. "I'm teaching ethics at the community college now," he wrote. "I tell students about us, not just the fraud, but how good people can lose their way when they forget what really matters." In her small cell at night, Regina worked on her memoir. Not the glossy success story she would have written years ago, but a raw account of ambition, fear, and the slow poison of believing your own lies. Publishers were already interested. "People need to understand how it happens," one wrote. "How dreams can turn into crimes when you stop questioning yourself." As her release date approached, Regina received an unexpected invitation. A women's business association wanted her to speak at their conference, not about success, but about failure, about redemption, about rebuilding from rock bottom. "Are you sure?" the warden asked when Regina requested permission to accept via video call. "The media will be all over this." Regina nodded. "That's the point," she said. "My biggest crime wasn't the fraud. It was pretending to be perfect." Young entrepreneurs need to hear that success without integrity is just failure in disguise. The day before the conference, Regina's daughter visited with exciting news. She'd been accepted to law school. I want to work in corporate accountability, she explained. Because of you, Mom. Both the mistakes and the redemption. For the first time in years, Regina cried tears of joy. That night, preparing her speech in her cell, Regina thought about the long journey from penthouse to prison, from lies to truth, from success to significance. Her story wasn't over. It was just beginning to be honest. Soon she would be free again. Not to rebuild her empire, but to build something far more valuable. A legacy of truth, second chances, and the courage to help others learn from her mistakes. Sometimes, she realized, you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to find what you were meant to give.